A dirt road runs 12 miles up Range Creek in the Book Cliffs of east-central Utah, and it ends at a locked gate. To get to that gate, you drive a long way past the last town, then a long way past the last pavement, then over a pass on a track that washes out in the spring and punishes anything without clearance. There is no reason to be on that road unless the canyon is where you are going. It does not lead anywhere else. For 50 years one family held the key to it, and when archaeologists finally came up that road with permission, the first thing they saw was not under their feet, but in front of them. Arrowheads were lying on the open ground, in the places where somebody had dropped them. Above, on ledges in the rock, sat granaries built of stone and mud, and inside some of them were corn cobs roughly 1,000 years old. Below, in the floodplain, the outlines of pit houses pushed up through the sod. Higher on the canyon wall, figures had been pecked into the stone, with trapezoidal bodies and horned heads. Here is the part that matters, and it is a narrower claim than the one usually made about this place. The canyon had not been dug. There were no pot hunter pits in the house floors, no trenches through the middens, no granaries torn open from the front. In the American West that is close to unheard of, because in a century and a half a valley like this gets worked over from end to end, by collectors, by dealers, by weekend diggers with a shovel and a Saturday. This one was not worked over. The man who held the key had already sold the ranch and moved out by the time the research began. He had grown up in that canyon and knew every ledge in it by sight. He was not a scholar and never pretended to be. He had no permit, no funding, no institution behind him, and no particular interest in what any of it meant. What he had was a gate, a road that went nowhere else, and 50 years of willingness to stand in it and be unpleasant. And when the canyon finally passed to the people who came to protect it, he said the thing nobody expected to hear from him, that in 50 years under his lock, nothing had happened to that land, and everything that happened to it happened afterward. Hold on to that sentence. We are going to test it. The word that got attached to Range Creek in the press was untouched, and that word is wrong. So let us replace it with the accurate one before going any further. Picture a normal site in Utah, a scatter of pottery fragments, a broken point, a dark stain in the soil where a structure stood, and a pit in the middle of it where somebody with a shovel got there in 1962 and took whatever looked like it belonged on a mantelpiece. What survives is whatever was too small, too broken, or too deep to be worth carrying out, and the whole discipline is built on reading the leftovers of that process backward, guessing at the shape of the thing from the shape of the whole. One historian put the Range Creek distinction about as plainly as it can be put. It is not that nobody ever took anything out of that canyon. It is that nobody went in and dug potholes. That is a smaller claim and a far more valuable one, because a removed arrowhead costs you an object, while a pothole costs you the floor, the hearth, the layers, and every relationship between them at once. So the teams were not trenching and screening dirt. They were walking, in a line, at a slow pace, recording positions because the material was already on the surface, and the job was to write down where it sat before anyone moved it. In 2004, the count of recorded sites ran into the low hundreds. It has been climbing ever since, past 400, and now to somewhere around 510, and it has never been closed, because the survey has never finished. Pit house villages, individual houses, dozens of granaries, then more, rock art panels by the score, grinding slabs sitting where somebody had been using them, points, beads, ceramic fragments, worked bone, and in some granaries, corn, actual cobs, dry and whole, 1,000 years on. Duncan Metcalf, the University of Utah archaeologist who took charge of the work, gave that canyon the better part of 2 decades. The survey has still covered only part of it. 12 miles of valley in the continental United States, with 1,000 years of human life sitting loose on the ground. And the reason it was still readable was not a statute or a park boundary. It was a gate. The people who left it are called the Fremont, and they are one of the genuinely difficult problems in North American archaeology. Even the name is borrowed. It comes from the Fremont River, and a young Harvard researcher named Noel Morse attached it to the culture in 1931, largely because the material needed to be called something. They lived across Utah and into the surrounding states for something close to 1,000 years, and they were farmers working at the outer edge of where corn will grow at all. They built pit houses instead of towns, and spread thin across canyons and benches in small groups. They made a distinctive grey coiled pottery and a distinctive basketry built around a rod and a bundle of fibres, and they made moccasins from the hock of a deer or a mountain sheep with the animal's dew claws left in place on the sole, the kind of detail that tells you these were specific people with specific habits and not a category invented by a filing system. They also made small unfired clay figurines with blank, watchful faces that looked like nothing else on the continent. And then they thin out of the record. Fremont material drops off sharply after about 1200 and is essentially gone by 1400, though some groups in the Great Salt Lake wetlands held on longer, and the arguments about who they were and what became of them have run for the better part of a century without landing. Part of the reason those arguments never land is a problem of evidence, and the Fremont got the worst of it. Their sites are shallow, they are scattered across open country, and they sit in a part of the world where surface collecting was an ordinary weekend activity for 4 generations. A good point went on a shelf, a good pot got sold. Nobody wrote down where any of it came from. So the Fremont record is not merely incomplete, it is selectively incomplete, edited by a century of people choosing the attractive objects and leaving the rest, which is the single most damaging thing you can do to a data set. That is why Range Creek mattered the moment the gate opened. Not because it was richer than everywhere else, because it had not been edited. In March of 1950, a rancher named Clarence Pilling was riding a side canyon off Range Creek, looked under a rock overhang, and found 11 unfired clay figurines, sitting where somebody had placed them about 1,000 years earlier. 4 to 6 inches tall, painted in red and buff and black, made in matching male and female pairs, with one female figure left without a partner. They are among the most important pieces of ancient portable art ever recovered in the American Southwest, and finding them made that drainage famous in exactly the circles you would not want your drainage to be famous in. Note where they came from: federal ground, in a side canyon, found by a rancher whose place lay north of the ranch this story is about. Range Creek was already on the map before anyone locked it. Peabody Museum crews had recorded sites in that drainage back in 1931. The next year, in 1951, a man named Ray Wilcox, everyone called him Budge, bought a spread of several thousand acres and 12 miles of that same creek, together with his sons, in one of the emptiest corners of the state, 150 miles from Salt Lake City, down roads that were mostly a rumor. It was a cattle operation, and a hard one. The family ran stock, fixed fence, hauled water and got through winters, and the ruins were part of the landscape the way the cliffs were part of the landscape. Waldo Wilcox was born in 1930 and grew up inside it. He never romanticized what he was living on top of, and he was blunt about that his whole life. He told a reporter once that he had grown up around a lot of dead Indians, and that was all he cared to know about it. He was equally blunt about the other thing. If he saw an arrowhead, he picked it up, and he was not going to lie to anybody about it. This is the part people get wrong when they retell the story. Waldo Wilcox was not a preservationist, and not the steward of a heritage landscape. He was a rancher who did not want strangers on his ground, and his ground happened to have 1,000 years of somebody else's life lying on top of it. Neighbours got turned back. Hunters got turned back. People who had heard about those figurines got turned back hardest of all. Then there are the Granaries, and this is where Range Creek stops being a story about preservation and becomes a story about the people who lived there. A granary is a small structure of stone and mud for storing food, and the ones on the canyon floor are ordinary. The ones on the cliffs are not. The Fremont built granaries high on vertical rock, some of them 1,000 feet or more above the valley bottom, on ledges that researchers can only document by bringing in people who climb and going down to them on rope. Stand at the bottom, look straight up at one, and the question asks itself, why would you put the thing you cannot survive without in the one place you can barely reach? And before you answer, add the labour. Every stone in that granary went up the same rock. So did the mud, so did the water to mix it, and so did every basket of corn on somebody's back, on a route with no margin for a bad step, in the fall at the end of a growing season, when the people carrying it were already tired. Nobody pays that price for a marginal advantage. The obvious answer is that they were hiding the food, and that was the working assumption for a long time. Then a researcher named Shannon Boomgarden, who now directs the field station in that canyon, did something simple and clever. Instead of asking how hard the granaries were to reach, she mapped what each one could see. 72 went into the sample. Every granary in the main canyon had a clear line to the valley floor for at least 100 meters, and many reached much further than that. 27 had 1 or 2 houses in direct sight. 23 had between 3 and 8. And to be straight with you about the numbers, 22 had no house in sight at all, so this is a strong pattern, not a universal law. But roughly 2 out of 3 of these structures were placed where the people who owned them could look up from the fields or the doorway and see them, and where anybody approaching one could be watched doing it. That tells you something about daily life in that canyon that no arrowhead ever will. You do not build a watch system around your food supply because of rodents. You build it because of people. Here is where the popular version of this story goes wrong, and where the canyon gets more interesting rather than less. The usual telling hangs the Fremont on the Great Drought, the brutal stretch from 1276 to 1299 that is written into tree rings all across the southwest, ring by ring, year by year, and that lines up with the emptying of the Four Corners. It is a real drought, and a serious explanation for a lot of things. It is not the explanation for this canyon, because by then Range Creek had already been empty for well over a century. The research team's own published work, Metcalf and Boomgarden among the authors, puts Fremont maize farming in Range Creek at roughly 750 to 1150 in the Common Era, with a cluster of radiocarbon dates landing around 1100. Whatever happened here happened in the 1200s at the latest, and more likely before, which points at a different and earlier dry period and takes the tidy southwest-wide story away from you. So sit with the actual shape of it. This canyon filled up, farmed hard for something like 4 centuries, built storage 1,000 feet up a cliff to keep watch over the harvest, and then stopped, 150 years before the collapse everyone else gets blamed on. And in some of those granaries, the corn is still there. Think about what food left in storage requires. People who leave a place slowly over bad years eat the stores on the way out. That is the entire purpose of stores. Corn still sitting in a granary means either that somebody expected to come back and did not, or that there was nobody left to come back. Both of those are sharper than drought by itself. Neither one is proven, and anybody who tells you otherwise is selling something. That is the honest position. The corn is a real, physical, measurable fact, and what it means is still open. The reason the question can be asked in this canyon at all is that the sealed granaries were still sealed. In a picked-over drainage they go first, because a closed granary is exactly what a collector most wants to open. In December of 2001, Waldo Wilcox sold. The buyer was the Trust for Public Land. The price was $2.5 million, and the property moved through federal and state hands until Utah held it. For 3 years, almost nothing was said publicly. Then, in late June of 2004, the wire services picked it up, and within days, a canyon whose scale nobody outside the profession had grasped was a national headline, wrapped in the phrase every outlet reached for at once: a lost world, untouched, frozen in time. That was the moment the arithmetic changed. A place stays intact through obscurity or through control, and Range Creek had both until the story ran, at which point it had neither. Access was restricted and permits were required, and the canyon is still deliberately hard to enter. Ownership shifted again in December of 2010, when a land exchange put the canyon in the hands of the University of Utah, which runs it through the Natural History Museum of Utah as a field station. And Waldo Wilcox spent the rest of his life saying none of it was good enough. He was openly, repeatedly, quotably critical about the road, about new foot trails spidering across the canyon, about the people now working there. He was also fighting about money, and it is dishonest to leave that out. He had wanted $4 million, took $2.5, kept the mineral rights, and made sure everyone knew he could lease them. He was not a saint, and he would have been insulted by the suggestion. But he was not simply bitter either, because an archaeologist documenting the canyon after the transfer found fresh damage, missing artifacts, disturbed ground, and a looter's hole dug straight into a pit house floor. And if you want the cleanest single measure of what he was arguing about, it is not in a policy file. It is one of those figurines. Number 2 disappeared while the collection was on public display between September of 1973 and January of 1974. Nobody noticed for years because another figure had broken in two and the count still came out right. In November of 2011, after nearly 4 decades, it arrived in the mail, sent anonymously to an anthropologist named Bonnie Pitt-Blado, with a note about a wandering acquaintance who had come by it around 1980. Lab work on the clay confirmed it. That object survived 1,000 years under a rock. It did not survive the museum. So let us go back and test his sentence, because he deserves that, and so do you. Nothing happened to that land in 50 years under his lock. Is it true? No. Not literally, and the people who now run the canyon are the ones who proved it. A University of Utah study of vandalism there examined more than 300 recorded sites and found evidence of damage at roughly 1/4 of them. Most of that damage looks like it happened in the 1950s and 60s. Trespassers repeatedly got past the Wilcox gates, and the sites within about 2 miles of the road took the worst of it. A gas exploration road cut in 1964 opened the canyon up for a while. So the postcard version, a sealed valley, perfectly frozen, one man against the world, is not what happened, and the canyon's own custodians say so in print. And yet, look at what the damage was and where it stopped. Surface collecting near a road, in a decade when every ranch family in Utah had a coffee can of Arrowheads on a shelf. What did not happen was the other thing, The systematic gutting, the potholes through the house floors, the granaries emptied for the market, the trenching that turns a site into a spoil pile. That is what 50 years of a locked gate actually bought, and it is a smaller claim than the headline made, and a much more useful one. Because the reason we know so little about the Fremont is not that they left nothing behind. They left an enormous amount across an enormous area over 1,000 years. The reason we know so little is that nearly everywhere else someone got there first and took the interesting pieces home. Range Creek is not a miracle. Range Creek is a control, the one place where you can measure what the rest of the West looked like before we handled it. You can go, incidentally. Permits are free and limited, a couple of dozen people a day, on foot or on horseback. And the rule is the whole argument of this story in one line. Look, photograph, and put nothing in your pocket. Because the only thing that has ever protected any of it is somebody deciding not to pick it up. For 50 years, that somebody was one difficult old rancher with a gate. Now it is whoever happens to be standing there. The canyon is still there, the arrowheads are still lying out, and most of it has still never been read.